Chuck Hegner was the victim of state-sponsored terror.
When these terrorists killed my husband, they threw my life into quicksand.
Miriam Lewin was the victim of state terror.
I can't understand how someone can kiss his wife and his children goodbye in the morning and then apply electric shocks to someone else's vagina.
Duane Claridge ordered acts of terror on behalf of his government.
Hitting a ship with a firecracker mine is terrorism. I would call it war.
We expect our leaders to protect, not terrorize us. And we have a right to expect governments to observe the law, not support the lawless. So what happens when the state breaks its bond of trust with its citizens and becomes a terrorist itself, or sponsors others in acts of terror? Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C. The final resting place for America's fallen heroes, and also of American victims of terrorism around the globe. The Hegner family have gathered from around the United States for the first time in 17 years to pay tribute to one such man. Chuck Hegner wasn't a soldier, and he wasn't a politician. He was an accountant.
Hi, Chuck. I'm back.
These are ordinary working Americans, trying to get by, trying to make sense of a world that crashed in on them all those years ago.
We've missed you every minute of the time you've been gone. He just adored you. I just hope that he's able to see you and to know that you're here. Chuck, I've needed you so many times. I had no one else to turn to.
On the night of December the 3rd, 1984, Chuck Hegner boarded Kuwait Airlines Flight 221 from Kuwait City to Karachi, Pakistan. Following a brief stopover in Dubai, the plane was hijacked by 4 terrorists who ordered the British captain to fly north to Iran.
They asked the Americans to come forward, and my husband was the only one that went up to the front of the plane. Now, the captain said he turned around and he saw my husband on his knees, and he had his hands in a position as if he were praying. And he said, Captain Clark said he had to turn his face away because he couldn't stand to see the fear that was in my husband's eyes. They shot him in the shoulder, and then they shot him in the neck and in the head. And then they just threw him out onto the tarmac.
Chuck Hegner's murderers were members of the Hezbollah terrorist group and were demanding the release of 4 of their comrades held captive in Kuwait. Hegner was the first to die at their hands. Then his colleague William Stanford was killed as part of a 6-day orgy of torture and murder.
I don't see a time where it's going to get easier.
You want to know what I'm thinking? But I had planned to grow old with him. After he died, I tried very hard to be strong. And the more I tried to get on with life, the worse it got. And 10 months after he died, I ended up in a psychiatric institute. I just couldn't accept that something so horrible could happen to such a nice family.
They gave Chuck Hegner a hero's welcome, and President Reagan sent a letter of condolence, and Vice President Bush spoke with feeling.
On behalf of our president and all Americans, we mourn the loss of Chuck Hegna and Bill Stanford. These two were husbands and fathers, good and decent men.
But the family have to this day not had justice or compensation for the loss of Chuck. What they do now know is that his death in Tehran was not just the result of a terrible terrorist act, but that the terrorists were being underwritten by the very state on whose soil the murder took place, Iran. Since overthrowing the Shah in 1979, the Islamic regime of Iran has been a persistent sponsor of terror beyond its borders, in particular through Hezbollah, which it uses to destabilize regimes and attack American and other Western targets. Presented with this evidence, on January the 18th, 2002, federal judge Henry Kennedy ordered Iran to pay the Hegna family $42 million in damages and a further $333 million in punitive damages. Iran has not responded to the charges or the judgment, but continues to support and supply Hezbollah and a number of other terrorist groups.
State-sponsored terrorism tends to be one of the more dangerous forms of terrorism precisely because the terrorist organizations enjoying the largesse, whether it's money, operational funds, intelligence assistance, logistic, or training, tend to be just more formidable enemies. They tend to be far more capable. They assume the attributes almost of an established nation's commando or elite strike force, because basically that's what they are. They're being trained now by an established nation state and having all these benefits of waging war. So their ability to punch above their weight is that much greater.
Iran, Iraq, Libya, and the recently deposed Taliban regime. They're all sponsors of terror. But no surprises there, really, for the actions of these countries have been widely reported. But state support of terror has also taken place nearer to home, and though now largely forgotten, it shows that even democratic governments can get drawn in. Meet the Contras, an army founded, funded, and armed by a foreign government. An army that punched way above its weight as it committed atrocities in its own country for 7 years in an undeclared war supported by a group of foreigners opposed to the government of Nicaragua. Those foreigners were the American President, Ronald Reagan, the Vice President, George Bush, and their closest advisors. In 1978, discontent against the corrupt pro-American regime of President Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua exploded into general insurrection. By 1979, the American public and President Carter finally lost all sympathy for Somoza when his National Guard soldiers executed an American reporter on camera. Within a month, Somoza had fled, and the opposition Sandinistas, led by Daniel Ortega, swept to power. In America, President Carter welcomed the change, but not everyone agreed.